Aid in medical research.
Aid has had an enormous impact on the development of Korean medicine since liberation. In particular, U.S. aid to Korean medical education, most notably the Minnesota Project, is often cited as a major factor in the establishment of American-styled medical education in Korea. However, the three pillars of medicine are education, clinical care, and research. Then, how was aid affected the research system in Korea? Particularly, let's look at the processes that led to Korea's transition out of the aid and into managing its own funding, thus selecting and implementing research topics. We will also examine the geopolitical context of the 1970s U.S. aid policy change as a backdrop to this policy shift, and trace the history of the Korean medical research system from its inception to its end. In the 1950s, stable funding for medical research was rare, and the amount of funding available through the Korean government or universities was minimal. Even at the best-funded university, Seoul National University, the total amount of funding available until 1961 was ranged from 400,000 to 700,000 won per year. And the number of projects funded was small, around 15. Many studies were funded out of pocket by each researcher. Because support from the Korean government or institutions was insufficient, foreign aid became the main source of funding for large-scale researches. The problem was that these grants were often organized around the issues of interest to the US government or donor agencies. So they often did not directly address the problems that were urgent in Korea. Alternatively, researchers often gained access to these grants through their personal connections with donor officials. Another route was to secure funding in line with the global research trends. For instance, since the 1960s, population control, which has dominated medical research resource in Korea and globally, has become a major source of funding. Even researchers who are not directly involved or interested in family planning, they often secure funding for their research projects by adding population research elements to their original topics. This external funding became a major source of resources in the face of poor domestic funding. But it also had disadvantages of being irregular and uncontrollable by the Korean government or institutions. Systematic efforts to secure research grants at the Korean government began in 1963 through the Academic Research Grant Program. It was established to encourage research activities of university professors in the natural science, humanities, and arts. This was available to full-time lecturers and above at public and private universities nationwide. However, the grants were unstable. In 1963, the first year of implementation, a total of 841 research projects were applied for, of which 126 were awarded a total of 17.24 million won. But in 1964, the grants were reduced by 30% in comparison with the previous year, and in 1965, they were cut entirely.
Medical Research and China Medical Board.
As such, government funding for research was either unstable or very low at around 200,000 won per researcher. Hence, each institution had to find its own sources of funding. The approach taken by medical schools with affiliated hospitals was to fund research out of the hospital surplus. Some of the autonomous budgets of medical schools were also utilized for clinical research. In the 1970s, as hospital usage increased and medical income grew, the amount of research funding also rose to 30 million won in 1973 and 89 million won in 1976. Because of their unique structure, medical schools were able to conduct a wider range of research than other colleges and universities. Although the Korean government and universities had begun to generate their own research funding, foreign sources still played an important role in research activities. One such organization was the China Medical Board, CMB in short, which had taken over the Minnesota project and provided aid to Korean medical education and research. The CMB was originally part of the Rockefeller Foundation, a U.S. private philanthropy organization established in 1914 to support the development of medical education in China. Following China's turn to communism in 1949, U.S.-China relationship was deteriorated and its assets in China were also seized. From the 1950s onwards, the organization shifted its focus to supporting the development of medicine in the US and Asia, with Korea being one of its key fields. Taking Seoul National University as an example, a total of $487,500 was granted to 97 research projects between 1963 and 1974. And the university was evaluated to have had a significant impact on improving the quality of education through research projects. In particular, these foreign aid funds helped researchers obtain research equipment that was not available in Korea. At the time, the Korean government was strictly managing foreign exchange for its economic development plans. In order to purchase equipment overseas, researchers had to pay in dollars and they were struggling to find those dollars. Instead of sending some of the aid money directly to Korean researchers, the China Medical Board would hold the money in a US bank and then pay for the researchers' purchases of certain equipment overseas and arrange for the equipment to be sent to Korea. This gave Korean researchers access to the latest equipment. By the early 1970s, grants from the CMB were still a major source of research funding, but universities had little say in the selection process. Prior to 1973, the review of research proposals and award decisions for CMB-funded research were all carried out by American officials, who are closely involved in the entire process of research planning, not just in deciding whether or not to award a grant. One of the distinctive features of the China Medical Board was that all staff, including its chairman, were basic medical scientists with many years of research and aid experiences. They carefully pointed out the prior research, methodology, and feasibility of the research plan, and responded to the researchers by correcting typos and wording in the plans and reports. During regular visits to check on the status of the support, they also personally interviewed the researcher and discussed the feasibility of the research, the utilization of the results, and the appropriate funding. On the one hand, these micro-interventions strengthened the researchers' capacity and provided them with important experiences in submitting proposals to other overseas funds. But on the other hand, they also suppressed the experience of autonomously operating the grant review system and had a strong influence on the direction of research in Korea.
Change in the U.S. aid policy.
The Nixon administration, which came to power in January 1969, called for a complete revision of foreign aid in the United States in the wake of the Vietnam War. the war created a multi-layered problem, from anti-war sentiment in the United States and abroad, a rising balance of payments deficit due to the rising cost of the war, and the undermining of the legitimacy of the U.S. involvement in the international affairs. The Peterson Committee, which was formed for such purpose, suggested that policies based on large-scale direct aid had failed to grow the economies of underdeveloped countries, and that the policy should be reoriented towards creating an enabling environment for private economic development. The Nixon Doctrine, that was released in 1969, called for minimizing direct U.S. military intervention, such as in the Vietnam War, supporting the autonomous action of Asian nations, and encouraging them to resolve conflicts and civil war as much as possible on their own. It also called for a shift in an aid policy to focus on economic aid rather than military aid, but to enhance mutual aid from various countries to avoid overburdening the U.S. In addition, the U.S. recession caused the value of the dollar to plummet, disrupting the U.S.-centric international monetary system and calling for a reduction in large-scale aid to developing countries. This shift in aid policy across the U.S. government began to have an impact on private philanthropy, such as the Rockefeller Foundation, a shift in aid policy that called for a gradual reduction in direct large-scale assistance, a focus on experimental and pioneering pilot projects, and a shift towards more fundamental development and capacity building by finding ways to leverage local resources. In short, this meant that there were a major reconstructing within organization and a reduction in direct aid. The China Medical Board was no exception, with the number of specialists available to review medical dossiers reduced from 8 to 4. For the reason, it was difficult for officials to review each research proposal in detail and comment on it or decide whether to support it. Many universities see the CMB as an endless source of funding that lasts forever, said the new chairman. He continued, another problem was psychological. Some universities and their directors have received funding from the CMB for so long that they now see it as a birthright. So they are offended when their requests for support are questioned or rejected. In the worst case, a dependency relationship has been created. What has emerged as a result was the policy of matching fund. In the aid, matching fund referred to the practice of donors providing aid in proportion to the fund raised by the recipients. In other words, if the US government provided $100 in aid to Korea, the Korean government raised $100 in matching funds, resulting in $200 in total. On the other hand, the practice of reviewing each researcher's research project individually and making direct payments has also decreased. Now, donor organizations provided a lump sum of money to Korean universities and research institutes to be used for research purposes, and Korean institutions can review and pay their own researchers. Advisors were dispatched to establish a system for reviewing these grants, which included criteria such as research feasibility, research plan and design, proper references and citations, and utilization of research results. These criteria were later spread to other universities to establish criteria for reviewing research proposals.
Securing research fund.
The CMB's policy shift from temporary support to the creation of permanent funds came in the form of the creation of endowment through matching fund. In October 1973, the Board of Directors of the China Medical Board resolved to gradually discontinue ad hoc aid and create a permanent fund based on endowments. Initially, the board said that it would not discuss the matter until each recipient university has secured sufficient resources from alumni associations, corporations, the government, and others. But in practice, it began sending letters to the deans of each school stating that regardless of whether the university was ready or not, the one-time or blanket grants would soon be discontinued. In 1975, CMB stated that it would only fund researches if universities receiving aid were able to secure an equal amount of matching fund. So universities began to look for ways to secure funding. The Korean government was already in favor of using state-run resources such as the Academic Research Fund, and companies were skeptical of funding that did not directly benefit them, such as technology development. The remaining source of funding was Alumni Association, especially Korean doctors in the United States, who began to flourish in the late 1960s. US aid authorities also actively encouraged the organization and use of Alumni Association in the US to secure funding. Paradoxically, the severe brain drain that followed the Minnesota Project created a community of Korean doctors in the United States that became an important source of funding for Korean medical schools to form their own endowments. The Seoul National University North American Alumni Association, organized in 1972, launched an alumni fundraising in 1976 to raise money for their alma mater. By the end of the year, they had raised the full $100,000 as planned. Eventually, in 1977, the North American Alumni Association and Alumni Association in Korea succeeded in raising $250,000, enabling them to establish a $500,000 research grant fund with $250,000 of CMB support. The booming Korean economy also made this support possible. Around 1980, matching funds deposited in banks were earned high interest rate of 18 to 21%. This high interest rate was a major factor in enabling the endowment to continue to fund research without losing seed money. The matching fund was able to provide approximately 13 million won in research grants. At an annual interest rate of about 18%, which was enough to fund several medium-sized researches. Furthermore, in the process of raising this fund, the university was able to secure research grants through various channels, such as cooperation and alumni associations, rather than relying on external sources or the government as in the past. And the entire process of raising, receiving, managing, and reviewing results became the university's own experiences. The economic development of the 1970s and the migration of doctors overseas gave Korean medical institutions considerable financial capacities. And the experiences gained through foreign aid, research funding from the Korean government, and securing their own research grants laid the foundations for medical research institutions to raise and manage their own funds.